Squawk Senior here, back on the M engine again. Kind of hot and humid outside, some rain coming and stuff, so figured a good time to spend a little bit of time in the shop here. Today we're going to see if we can get the oil pump in, the pan on and stuff, and get the bottom side of this engine all buttoned up so we can turn it over and start working on the head area and stuff. Here I've got everything laid out, all cleaned. Got the gear on the oil pump lubricated with some assembly lube. I also did the gear on the camshaft inside. Got all the bolts all cleaned up and the threads cleaned and stuff. I'm going to use 2 guide pins. I'll screw them into blocks when I slide the pan on. It helps keep the gasket here in alignment. And I also have the pan laying here all cleaned up and buffed. And yes, this engine will be painted. Not sure about the rest of the tractor, but we definitely will be doing the engine. Another thing I'm going to cover here a little bit is I've had some questions asked about sealers and stuff. One of them was putting a sealer on the gasket in the oil pump. Basically, my opinion with the sealer in there, this is a highly machined surface. It's used to set your gear clearances and stuff inside. Right now I'm right on spec at the low end. And I feel sealer could definitely change your clearance specs and stuff. And being a highly machined surface, you don't really need sealer in there anyway. And also, this pump is way overrated on gallons per minute, what it will supply the engine. And that's why the pressure relief spring is in here. All the excess pressure goes back into the oil pump and it doesn't create excessive pressure. Now, on the pan gaskets, a little different story. I'll definitely put sealer on these, and this is one case where if you want to learn anything about sealers, tear something down that somebody else has fixed. You'll definitely find out what not to do. Myself, I just put a thin coating on these. One thing it is, this would leach oil to the external part of the engine, which you don't want to do that, especially if you got a nice paint job on it and stuff like that. So anyway, another reason I'll put like a silicone on is for later disassembly if you have to. This gaskets won't glue on quite as tight if you use the right type of sealer. And I have been using the Ultra Black by Permatex gasket maker. That seems to be working pretty good for most of this stuff. But if you've got a really good machine surface, this is a case where if a little does a little good, a whole lot won't do a whole lot of good. It'll just cause problems. I've seen oil passages plugged. I've seen big old rolls of sealer on the inside of a gasket surface, bobbing a pan, plugging oil screens and everything. So sealer is good if used the way it should be used, and overuse is generally bad. So, and as far as sealers goes, it's kind of a personal preference what you do. Your experience is going to dictate how you want to do it and stuff. So, and I'm just going to kind of go the way that I do it. It's been working for me, so I'm going to continue doing that. Now we get over here to the engine. I do have a few places where you have different surfaces mating. I will put a little extra heavy bead on these areas to keep oil from leaching out the side. And with a cork gasket also, you'll get some compression in there, which will help form into the deformities of the block if you got a lot of rust pitting. Back on the rear main seal area, you got 2 rubber plugs. I've got one cut off here already, and you can see how it extends up here. I'm going to cut that off because when I took this apart, whoever had this apart before, looked like they just left them high and they squished out, and I was getting a lot of oil leakage in the back part, and I think that was part of my problem. It was leaking back in this area here through that gasket, wasn't sealing around real good here. So I'm going to cut them off. These little plugs, all they do is seal this plate in the back from leaching oil through. So then I'll put a little extra dab on them too, just to make sure that they don't leak. So anyway, let's get this oil pump in. Okay, I've got a bar in the crankshaft because when you put this in, you may have to turn the cam a little bit to get the gears to mesh. Get everything started. It's a pretty good fit in there. Try not to let her drop too hard on the gears. And I got lucky. She went right into mesh. So anyway, we'll get these bolts in, get her tightened down, and go on to the next step. Next up, we're going to get the oil pickup screen in. Basically, only one way this can go in. You got two stops here. It goes in right here, and the stops keep it going. This is what they call a floating oil screen. It keeps it at the top of the oil. If it sinks down into the sump of the oil pan, you could be picking up dirtier oil. So this is what they call a floating oil pickup screen. You just slide it in, and it's retained just by a cotter pin. It goes through the hole here. You just fold that over, and you can see that keeps her in position. Well, I got a thin coating of gasket material on the or sealer on the bottom side here. You can see a little squeeze out where I filled in my joints and stuff there. So let's get another thin coat on this side, and we'll get that pan on. I just smeared it on with my finger. I get better control. Some of these will tell you to put a bead on. A lot of your more modern engines and stuff now don't use gaskets at all. They just use a sealer like this. And when I use gaskets, I just put a thin coating on. If you get all your surfaces cleaned and everything the way they should be, you shouldn't really need any more than that. Got the gasket sealer on, got my guide pins in. I just put one on each side. I do have just a stud on the back will help me line it up there. That'll help me line it up easier, slide it around without disturbing that gasket. Now there is two different lengths of bolts in this. I got 16 of them at 7/8 of an inch, and I have 2 of them at 1 1/8. The reason for the 1 1/8 is for this plate back here. One goes on each side to compensate for the thickness of that plate. We get all these bolts in, get them snugged down, and then I'll get back. I'll tell you what I'll do after I get them snugged. Finish getting these bolts finger tight. I'll probably just get them started here anyway. And get my alignment stud out of the way. And what I do with these, I usually take and cut a screwdriver slot in the top. And to me, it just makes it easier to get these out of the way. Sometimes they'll bind in and you do need a little extra, and this just helps you get them out of the way. Just take the speed wrench and we'll just get them so they're snug. Got them just barely snugged up, so right now I'm just going to let this set. I'll come back to it in a little bit and we'll do the final tightening. I cannot find any torque spec on this, but I've done enough of these. I can pretty much do it by feel. If you guys are really wanting to get into it, you can probably with a cork gasket, you don't want to over tighten them a lot of times. I'll just kind of watch the gasket or the sealer. If I start getting a squeeze out or if I see the cork kind of moving a little bit, I quit. So it's just a matter of different techniques for different people. I'm back for the final tightening on this. Usually I just do this by feel. I've done enough of these, you can pretty much tell by feel. But for you guys that like a torque wrench, what I'm going to do, I've just got a cheap old inch pound here. Generally a bolt like this on a cork gasket, 5 to 7 foot-pounds. So if you want to figure out how many inch pounds, just multiply 5 times 12, you get 60 inch pounds. I'm going to do 75 inch pounds on these. Gives me about 6 foot-pounds that way. So I'm pretty much all the way around. We'll finish this up and this lower end will be done. The only thing with this type, it's not a clicker type. You got to be able to read this. You got the swivel joint there. Don't let it bottom out. Just keep it centered. So you're just pulling on this pin right here. Okay, bottom end's done. We'll get this thing flipped up and start working on the rest of the accessories for this block. Next up, I'm going to install the cover over the water jacket here on the block. I have everything laid out here on the bench, got everything cleaned up, nuts and bolts, run the tap and die through them. What I'm going to do first is put a coat of sealer on the gasket and then install that on the block. And I'll probably put some, I don't know if you noticed, here's a piece that's got some extra pitting and stuff. There's an area, you know, around this whole thing. I will do a little bit extra of sealer on that. Then we'll see what we look like after we get this thing installed. First off, I'm going to put just a thin coating on this side of the gasket. This side will be going to the cast iron block, which is a really good surface. So it'll be just a real light coating on here. Okay, got one side of the gasket covered with a thin coating. We'll get that installed on the block. It's kind of nice when they have studs. You don't have to worry about extra holding the gasket in place or anything. So, usually I put stuff on both sides of the gasket, but in this case with them rust pits on the cover, I'm going to install it on there so I make sure I get them rust pits covered pretty good. Okay, next up, as you can see, pretty good pitting and stuff there, so we'll get a layer on them. Make sure we get any possible leaks. Like I say, this is for the water jacket, so you don't want anything seeping onto the block. And with these rust pits, I will do a little bit heavier coating on there. Make sure I get around the bolt holes real good. Like I say, it's a little thicker than I normally use, but due to circumstances, sometimes you got to do that. Now I've got a layer that I'm satisfied with here. On this product, it recommends to let this set and tack up a little bit, so we're going to let that set for a little bit here before we install it, and then we'll get into getting this on, getting her torqued down. Okay, we've got the sealers tacked up. And make sure we got a top mark on that. That goes up. This thing has got baffles inside, so get that on there. And start getting all the nuts and bolts in. This is just, there's no lock washers here. It's just flat washers go on. Putting all this together with chase threads really makes life a lot easier. Everything goes on finger tight. You're not fighting anything. Get a more accurate torque on your bolts. All the nuts and bolts all started, so we're just going to start just with the speed wrench. We'll just start tightening things down. We're not going to go real tight to start with. Just get them till they just get barely snug. Okay, I'm going to go over one more time just to get them a little bit snugger before the torque wrench. And now the torque wrench, and I am going to do 175 inch-pounds again, which gives me in the area of 5 to 7 foot-pounds. Okay, I'm happy with that. I am seeing squeeze out here, especially on my, where I put a little heavier on the cover side. So I feel pretty confident that I'm going to have a pretty good seal. So, okay, looks like we're making some progress anyway.